You're listening to Food Trucks in Babylon, a Western Seminary podcast with Dr. Todd Miles and Dr. Patrick Schreiner. Listen as they discuss matters of faith, theology, and culture in a post-Christian world.
Hey everyone, this is Patrick. I just wanted to give a little preamble to this episode. We actually recorded this episode a few weeks back, and we were planning on releasing it in our second season, but we thought there might be some helpful things in terms of what we're going through currently with the coronavirus. So what we're speaking of is digital church, internet church, but keep in mind as we speak, we were speaking before the pandemic hit, and so we were trying to think, everything else is normal. How do we interact with virtual online church? So there are going to be things that apply, but then there's also going to be things that we actually didn't realize all this was coming, so forth and so on. So we hope you enjoy the episode, but I want you to keep that in mind. We have guests on there, some pastors from around the town. One of them is Jay Kim, and we're going to speak about his book, which is just coming out now. He also runs Regeneration Podcast, so I'd encourage you to check it out. But hope you enjoy the episode. I hope you find it helpful, and that's it. So here we go. We have some special guests with us today. We're going to talk about internet church, and we just had a conference actually yesterday. When you're listening to us, this is probably a few months ago, but we had a conference, Western Seminary and Crossroads Church in Vancouver had a conference discussing what do we do with the rise of technology and church and the intersection between those two. So
actually, it goes on today. It's a 2-day thing.
It's a 2-day
We're just
thing.
On Western's campus.
Yeah, they didn't invite me to be a part of it.
That's true. We did not invite you, Patrick.
Exactly.
It's true.
They didn't want my voice in this, but now I get to say something because they're on the podcast with us. So anyways, we have some guests with us, so I'm going to have them go around just really quickly and introduce themselves. So why don't we just go around this way and yeah.
Totally. Well, thanks, Patrick. My name is Jay Kim, and I'm a pastor in the Silicon Valley of California, and wrote a book called Analog Church, which sort of delves into this. And
nice.
Looking forward to the
about to come
chat.
out, but when you're listening to this, it's already out.
Yeah, that's right.
That's great with IVP, right?
Yep.
It's
IVP.
That's great. That's great. Yeah.
So by the time you've heard this, if you didn't buy it, you've lost your discount. Like, go back in time.
You mean the $1.80 discount?
Totally, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. This is Gerry Breshears. I'm a professor of theology.
Gary's back. Gary's back again. You know, you've heard Gerry a lot on this, but he's back. So
he's back.
Yeah.
So good. Yeah, and I'm Gabe Moreno. I'm the executive pastor of ministries at Crossroads Community Church in Vancouver, Washington, and I oversee the internet campus.
Great. So I'm going to just turn it over to Gabe here since you oversee the internet campus, and let's just define quickly what we're talking about. What is this that you all are doing,
right? So
that we can have a good discussion and actually know what we're talking about to begin with.
Wonderful. Yeah. That's so good. So for us, internet campus might be a misnomer in that really it's an internet strategy. We definitely do not advocate for an online-only strategy.
Okay.
So whereas there are other church movements that are exclusively online and even some app-based driven church expressions. So for us, really, internet campus is really the result of a very intentional evangelistic outreach. And so leveraging technology to do evangelism. Our church is very passionate about evangelism, pulpit evangelism, and almost in every group gathering that we have at Crossroads, it's all evangelistically based. And so what we found is in order to leverage current content, the internet was the printing press of our time.
Yeah, right.
In trying to use that as effectively as possible.
Okay. So can you just explain kind of briefly what that looks like?
100%. Yeah, that's great. Cool. Yeah. So our pastor, like I said, really stands on the shoulders of our founding pastor at Crossroads, Dr. Bill Ritchie, who for decades utilized radio to reach out and reach people. So even to this day, now the church is quite, intergenerational. And the bulk of those people who are in that older demographic were there because of radio. And so now, like, you have the radio generation And then you have the internet generation,
Right,
the people who heard about
iGen.
Crossroads. Yeah, exactly. And those two things converge on the Crossroads campus, both physically and then online. And it is really quite beautiful to see because it's an intersection. It's where people kind of connect. And so, so we leverage Facebook, YouTube, starting to get into some other platforms as well as our online platform, but really to get the message of Jesus out to the community. We give people an opportunity to respond to an altar call online, to fill out connection cards online. Couple limited sacraments you're able to transfer well online, but really just a thriving community there online.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah. So what kind of, I'm going to pitch it back to you one more time, but what kind of fruit have you seen from this? Have you seen people enter the church through this and come physically? Because I know you kind of presented a spectrum there in terms of some, TV Church is doing completely online. Is that correct? I think I've heard of TV Church, but I haven't really checked it out.
Yeah. There are several that are completely online, and completely you send an avatar in, and you pick your avatar.
Is this
VR Church?
Yeah.
VR Church.
Yeah. Is this like Princess Leia, like Obi-Wan Kenobi, like we need your help? Is that what we're talking about?
That's a hologram.
Yeah, that's a hologram.
That's
what I'm waiting for.
Hologram tech.
Okay.
Yeah, totally, man.
Yeah.
Like Tupac at that music festival.
Coachella. He was like,
right.
Yeah.
Well, we're not that technology, but I'm looking forward to that day. Yeah.
I want an avatar of you, Patrick. I want an avatar of you.
Me.
How long will the mustache
As
be?
long as the mustache is represented on the avatar, I'm okay.
I'll settle for a bobblehead. Bobblehead, Gary.
Okay, so there's at least a spectrum. It sounds like you guys aren't quite where they would be in terms of purely online.
Right.
Oh, not at all.
Right. Yeah. And I think
because obviously you have a physical presence.
Correct.
So is the goal to get people to the church physically or a campus physically?
You know what's so funny? The goal is to get people saved.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, we're so old school.
Yeah.
It's pretty old school. But the goal is like get the gospel out there.
Yeah.
Pastor Daniel records these 2-minute messages on Facebook, and he uses the term like chumming the water, right? And it's very unchurched language. We catch a lot of flack because he doesn't cite Bible verses. But he's like, look, I'm not trying to do church online. I'm trying to chum the water to be where the people are.
Yeah.
To hopefully get them to watch a 3-minute sermon clip where I cite the scriptures. So it's a strategy, an intentional strategy, but to evangelize people. Gotcha. Once we see them respond, the goal isn't even to necessarily get them to come to Crossroads, because a number of the people, I mean, it's thousands and thousands of people who are now nowhere near the area. Right. So one of the things that blesses my heart is what we found is that there's like 3 buckets. Mm-hmm. There's people who don't go to church. Yeah. There's people who won't go to church. And then there's people who can't go. Mm-hmm. And so meeting those 3 buckets where they're at and encouraging them to take those next steps, I think that's really what adds jet fuel to our fire. And so based on where we are in those buckets, a next step for you might look differently. Yeah. But we get excited for all of them.
Cool. That's really good.
Even if it means going to a local church in your side, we would recommend that.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Tell them about the Canadian couple you showed us yesterday. Yeah. That's a good example of what people think of when they think of internet.
Yeah, Troy and Lisa, she's very tech savvy. They're out in Canada, and they stumbled upon Crossroads. They're nowhere near like a church where that they can participate in, and so they're very active online.
Is that because they're in Canada?
It's because they're in Canada, in the woods. There's just maple syrup.
I'm sorry, Canadians who are listening. I was just there, and there are people there. I know there are. No.
There are some.
They're up in the Calgary area, but remote.
Yeah, pretty remote.
Yeah.
But somehow, internet connection works,
Okay.
And so for them, they feel very much a part of that community.
Good.
And we actually relied on them, like, hey, let us know how our processes work. Like, were you able to volunteer and go through our volunteer onboarding process? And is that broken? And like, we want to do this better. So we try to think of it from the end user's point of view and really want to work on that process.
Good. So Jay, you've written this book. Have you interacted with some of this in terms of, it seems like your book is moving towards more physical presence. Yeah. Just give me some thoughts about this in terms of your interaction with this.
The title of your book.
Totally. Yeah. The book is called Analog Church. Yeah. And the subtitle is Why We Need Real People, Places, and Things in the Digital Age. Yeah. And dude, Gabe, thank you so much for sharing all that. It's like
fist bump.
Well, you can't see it, but it happened. You got to believe us. One of the things interesting for me when we talk about online church or virtual church or whatever, it's not monolithic, right? So it's not like, oh, when we say that phrase, I mean, Gabe just very beautifully, eloquently explained it. We have an assumption that just means a church that doesn't care about physical presence. They just want you to go on your computer and watch some content and leave.
Right.
And that's real. Those are there are churches like that. Crossroads is not one of those churches. So it's not monolithic. You know, we need, I think, probably an expansive dictionary of words to describe the different ways we use online. Gabe, I love what you said. It's about leveraging the technology in order to do much more than what the technology can do. And I think that's probably digital technology and its intersection with ecclesiology at its finest, is that when we put it in its rightful place. And that's really what I'm trying to do in the book, essentially, is to argue, listen, I'm not asking anybody to become a Luddite. You know, we're recording this and people are listening because of digital technology, and that's a tremendous benefit. But my concern has been that so often churches begin to sort of recklessly lean into the technologies of the day. And when we do that recklessly and carelessly, it has deep implications and tremendous influence in unknowing ways even on our ecclesiology, on the way we think about and the way we teach people what it means to be the church, the gathered people of God. So, that's what I'm trying to tackle. I mean, you know, Gabe, you mentioned the printing press earlier, the print age, and that's such a great example, right? Like when Gutenberg's printing press came out 15th century, and it put books in the hands of the masses, dude, it changed everything in the church. Like literally, right? Like from the structure of the gathering to the replacing of the communion table with the sermon as sort of the centerpiece. I'm not saying any of that stuff is bad. It's actually huge benefits in terms of the rise of systematic theology kind of comes out of that era. Even the way gathering spaces like were designed architecturally begins to change. They begin to reflect books, you know, it's wild stuff. And that's been true with like the broadcast age and television studios and mega churches that look like, you know, seating for audiences instead of congregations. My concern with the digital age is that the digital age and its technologies are, for the first time in human experience, proactively working toward disembodied realities in human experience. So digital technologies are the first technologies in human history where the goal is actually to have you have to allow us to have experiences where we don't physically have to show up anywhere. And I think that has deep implications for how we understand what it means to be the church, and not just the church, but as the church, to grow in more Christ-likeness, which demands communal, physical, relational presence with one another as we journey alongside Christ together. So that's my main concern. So I'm really encouraged to hear, you know, for Crossroads, that's like a front door. That's a metaphor I like to use. Like the front door obviously is important, but the goal ultimately is to invite folks into around the kitchen table and the living room, and you know. So
one of the things I'm thinking church history now, that same accusation was made of the book, because I don't have to gather and listen to somebody read the scripture. And so that was one of the criticisms back after Gutenberg started doing his thing in the Reformation. I don't have to gather to read the scripture. I can read it at home, and it's disembodied from the gathering. And I'm reading a book instead of listening to a person. That was
I'm
but
with
it's
you.
further down that way, to be sure.
Yeah, I'm with you, Gary. I think on the front edge of new technologies, we do have to be tempered in the way we think about it. Like even the written word, the Greek philosophers were like, we shouldn't be writing down words. We're going to lose human memory if we write.
Go back
and it's like, well, if we didn't write, think about where we would be as a human race, you know? So,
well, think how good our memories are these days.
So there's give and take there for sure.
And very early on, even backing up further, the Christians adopted a technology of types with a codex, because most things were in scrolls.
Totally.
And then the codex was actually invented, and the Christians were the one who actually said, hey, this actually works really well for a unified kind of story and book that we're putting all together. So they were the ones who actually took that codex idea and proliferated it to the ancient world at that point.
And the mission was always the same, is to glorify Christ. And I think the method is something that faithful believers across millennia have been flirting with and dating, but they're married to the mission of making Christ known by whatever means necessary.
And that's why your book is so good, Jay, is try to think through the pluses and minuses of internet technology and social media and those kind of things. It's just super. I say this because I really like the book. That's why I drove you up here.
You've already read it.
Yeah. Thanks, Gary.
Yeah.
I think that the people in your neck of the woods would speak to the dangers of, like, you hear about all those Silicon Valley execs who limit screen time for their own children. Right. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I'm super curious about what you guys are seeing there.
Man. Well, Steve Jobs was the prime example, right? He was on the record as saying, essentially, I'm paraphrasing, I don't let my kids use the stuff I make.
Right.
Because he was deeply aware of its addictive nature. And that's such a great question. I think it is the question, one of the questions that church leaders especially need to be asking, primarily because for me, I love what you said earlier, Gabe, about we're just trying to get people saved. And I think by that, you and I we would all agree, by that, what we mean is not simply the decision on the front end, but the long process. The theological word would be, the differentiation would be justification and sanctification.
Correct.
The long process of becoming formed into the likeness of Jesus. And I think when it comes to that part, that all essential part of the process, digital technologies have a way of like undoing some of the stuff that it demands. It's deep, slow, steady, patient, communal work. And those things stand like a direct opposition of the ethos of the digital age, which is like really shallow and fast and instantaneous and isolated and all those things. So in the Silicon Valley, I think, there's a bunch of people at our church and a bunch of friends, simply because of where I live, who live their lives in that world and create that stuff. And one of the most helpful things for me has been surrounded by people who are making the things that we're all using. I've sort of gleaned from them a little bit, at least, of the ability to be able to see the stuff as stuff. So like when I grab my phone, obviously it's really easy to just fall, like so deep into the sort of like social media endless vortex. But because of just my proximity to people who make this stuff, I'm often able to look at it and go, actually, what's really happening is I'm sitting in a room with real people in embodied presence, staring at a metal box. You know what I mean?
Black Mirror.
Yeah, totally,
like
man. Absolutely, like the show. So when we're able to see it for what it is, I think it becomes really helpful.
Yeah. Gabe, if somebody accepts Christ through an internet service or whatever, what happens next?
Yeah, well, I love that you asked that. So one of the areas where I think careless is maybe the wrong word, but we were so optimistic. It's like, we're going to give altar calls. And then we never thought about the back end. And so I was joking at the conference yesterday how the articulation and the giving of the altar call actually forced us to develop systems. So the guys in the room who drive some of those systems, Scott's in the room right now, but our new believers process has a workflow that we manage through databases. We've looked at open rates on emails and text messages, and how do we leverage content we've already created so that we can follow up with these people in a meaningful and deep way. We utilize old school calling people on the phone within 24 hours of a decision. That's something that also Scott oversees. And what's cool is, yes, it forced us to develop a number of systems, but then we have to seek the Lord and like send the helpers, because how do we do this? And so we have new believers teams, people who are just excited to be there, and phone call, the call center, I think is the phrase that we use. But people who give of their Monday nights and their Wednesday nights to come and just do follow-up phone calls and to connect with people. Scott and I were talking about earlier, just the power of confession. And that's something that happens quite regularly online. James says to confess your sins that you might be healed. And so we see that. So training our folks that way to be a part, because people, there's a plus and a minus through that anonymity that comes through online presence. And people sometimes overshare something that they wouldn't probably share face to face. And so we're dealing with a number of things. So the equipping, the systems in place, it's a lot.
And those videos?
Yep, the videos.
Tell them about that. That was pretty amazing.
Yes, we have the 2-minute videos, and then we have discipleship videos that get sent out to people. We follow up with them. There's questionnaires, and those things just get leaked. There's on a schedule, 2 to 3 the first week, and then it kind of lessens so that we don't blow up people's inbox, and then delete us. But all those things, again, we made the joke yesterday, like our life at Crossroads, our workload would be much less if we stopped giving altar calls. It would be way easier to just get together, have a Bible study, and be like, well, see you next week. But the altar call, there's a responsibility that we feel is ours. And so it's created quite a big thing for us.
Is there ways that you all try to get people plugged into local communities? Do you have partnerships with churches in different areas? How does that work in terms of plugging them into an encouraging community that might not be online only, but also embodied and physical? What does that look like?
Yeah. So Daniel said this yesterday. He's like, you know what? I don't know if I would plug in someone to just any church, because not all churches are, just because you have church connected to it doesn't mean you're a safe place or a place where your soul will be cared for. So I feel like I'm allowed to say that here on the podcast. But one of the benefits of our pastor being just an awesome guy who gets to travel out, we're actually gone all next week and a little bit the week after that, just traveling and speaking, is that he does have a number of healthy partnerships and relationships. So we're not trying to build a following in the sense that Facebook and social media wants following. We really want community. And we totally adhere to the church with a big C, Universal Church. And so love to plug people in areas that we know are safe and are Jesus-loving, caring places for sure.
And do you guys stay in contact with people after they've been plugged in, or is there kind of like a release time?
That's a great question. I think that's an area of growth for us. Like circle back. It could be as easy as the moment the person gets saved, we set we follow up with them and they complete the process to set a 90-day follow back. Right. And that's an area where we can definitely grow.
It reminds me kind of the Billy Graham era in terms of, he would come into town and gather thousands and thousands of people. And then as time went on, I don't know if I'm getting this history completely right, but as time went on, they realized like we're not, like, people are coming forward, but then they started having people come alongside them and even having recommended churches and places to plug people in. So they were working through those systems and processes.
That infrastructure is crucial. Exactly. And I mean, it is a percentage of people who make the decision and follow through. Right. But I would take the small percentage that do over none, over no percentage.
Right. And you still have, you go around churches, people have critiques of the Billy Graham era, but at the same time, many of the people serving in churches now are actually hugely affected by Billy Graham coming into the area and preaching, and they heard the gospel and they responded, and they're in church now because of that. And so no matter what critiques you have, a lot of the modern day church is actually built off some of what he did, not him purely, but he was a huge part of the ministry in the past. So
along those lines, I think one of the things to pay attention to, Daniel Fusco, the lead pastor at Crossroads, is like incredibly gifted communicator. Just like national speaker, that sort of thing. But those guys are really rare, and I think, and it sounds like you guys are doing a lot of that through the partnerships. And I think that's so important, right? Is to figure out a way where if someone's initial experience of Jesus in some form or fashion is through this incredibly gifted, dynamic, charismatic leader, and then they go to their local church, right? And maybe on paper, at least, it just feels like, oh, this guy is not as great of a teacher or whatever as Daniel, and that sort of, what do we do there? Which there's just such a much more robust sort of ecclesiology than, I love this guy's preaching, so I got to go to church. And I think that's a great challenge, especially in the digital age. I think about it all the time as a church leader, man, because it's like every Sunday you show up to church and there's people there, there's that fleshly side of us that's insecure, and we're like, you could just stay home and listen to as many Keller
preachers ever.
Like you can listen to as many Keller and Francis Chan sermons as you want, and here you are. Right. But here they are, and that matters, And so I think that's a challenge not just for Crossroads, but for all of us in so many ways.
And I think that's where churches need to step up and say, we're not just a community where you hear preaching, but we're a community together where you're fed, not just Sunday mornings, but interpersonally, interrelationally.
Where ultimately you're called to participate.
That's right.
Be a part of.
Because you can't compete with, honestly, just the star preachers.
Content. That's right. Like if content is the currency, then it's not going to work.
Exactly.
That's right.
It has to be experiential.
Yeah.
For sure.
Well, we've been going for a little while here. We're going to take a break and then come back and keep discussing this.
My name is Kevin Miller, and I'm in the Theophilus program here at Western Seminary, working on my MDiv. Two things I really love about the Theophilus program. First is the cohort-style learning. I have come to love and really cherish my time with the people in my cohort. I've been in the program for 9 months now, and it's one of my favorite things about being a part of the classes. The second thing I really love about Theophilus is the emphasis on practical application. So whatever we're learning, whether it be hermeneutics or theology, it's always being applied. How does this affect people in our ministry context? Western Seminary serves as a catalyst and resource for spiritual transformation by providing with and for the church advanced training for strategic ministry roles. If you're interested in learning more about Western or starting your application, visit us online at westernseminary.edu. Now back to the show.
Welcome back. We're talking about Internet Church, and this is Food Trucks in Babylon. So I need food truck recommendations. You're in Vancouver, Gabe, and you're in Silicon Valley area. Jay, so why don't we start with you, Vancouver area or Portland?
I lived in Portland for a couple of years, and then I just recently moved to Vancouver. So in Portland, 808 Grinds, which is phenomenal Hawaiian. And then...
Do you know where that is?
That's on, it's by the Taylor Street Fountains.
Okay. Yeah, great.
And then in Vancouver, there's a really great taqueria. I'm from Mexico. And believe it or not, they have decent tacos in Vantucky,
nice.
Which is what we
Vantucky. I'm from Kentucky, so don't say anything else. That's great. What about you, Jay?
Oh, man. Well, I'm going to make a lot of enemies at home, but the food in the Silicon Valley just doesn't match up with Pacific Northwest.
Yeah.
So,
Amen. Preach. Amen.
I'm just being honest, man. It's just real, you know?
You guys got like nice black boxes called the iPhone, but we've got embodied food.
That's right.
I'm just kidding.
That's right.
See what you did there.
Yeah, you can't eat your iPad.
That's right. That's right.
Take that.
That'll be the next step.
Yeah. Cool.
Just for dinner last night, I went with some friends to a place that was a food cart, I think, and now is like a brick and mortar restaurant called Hapa Ramen PDX.
Oh, okay.
It's awesome.
Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah. Show you ramen fish broth. It was just the best.
That's great. Okay, we're going to jump back in here and keep talking about Internet Church. And so, Jay, will you just give us some more specifics in terms of your concerns of what this could turn into?
Yeah. What are the real dangers that are there? Because we don't want to go there.
Yeah, totally. Well, I think I briefly hit on it a little bit earlier, but the best way to say it is I have formational concerns about the digital age. Again, I think if we put digital technologies in their rightful place, just like Gabe is saying, they're incredible tools as sort of initiating spaces for people, because you can introduce yourself and you can introduce Jesus and the gospel to anybody around the world, almost anybody around the world. But again, I think when we talk about Christian discipleship, being formed into the likeness of Christ, we would all agree the introduction of the gospel of Jesus is an introduction, and then it's an invitation into a lifelong process. And I think that differentiation is really important for me, because if digital technology becomes the sustaining platform for the entirety of the journey, rather than just the introduction, the platform, digital technologies, which are so effective as mediums for introduction, actually, in my opinion, become harmful as platforms for the journey of Christ-likeness. What I mean by that is digital technologies are based on 3 key values. I get into this a little bit in the book, but the values essentially are speed, choice, and individualism. So in the digital age, everything is about speed. Everything is about faster, faster, faster. It's about choice. I can pick anything from anywhere around the world at any time. And it's about individualism. Like, I can customize and personalize anything. And now, actually, I don't even have to customize. Machine algorithms customize for me. So my my feeds and my whatever, what pops up when I open Amazon, all of that stuff. It's like machines are customizing and curating my digital experience in a way where it's like, oh, this is exactly the stuff I'm looking for. Well, the reality is when those values go unchecked, which they have, I think, for so many of us, they turn in on themselves. So the speed actually makes us incredibly impatient. The plethora of choices makes us incredibly shallow because we don't ever have to sink deeply into anything. We just move on to the next thing because there's endless choices. And the individualism actually leads to utter isolation, which, like, even the spike in rates of depression and anxiety showing that, right? So, and that's the challenge for me, because when I think about discipleship to Jesus is actually a slow and steady, patient work. It's incredibly deep, and it's by its very nature communal.
Yeah.
So, like, you know, impatience, shallowness, and isolation stand in stark contrast to patience and depth and community. And that's my biggest concern, is that we recognize that the technologies that we are leveraging, if we allow them to go unchecked, and if we actually allow them to go further in the process of helping people become like Christ than they should, they actually counteract the thing we're trying to accomplish, which is not just to get people into an introduction to Jesus and the gospel, but rather an invitation to a lifelong process.
Yeah.
Leonard Ravenhill a long time ago said the sermon is not a product, it is a participation.
Yeah.
And I think that what we are trying to do at Crossroads is to really make clear call to actions. You know, our mission statement, part of it is simply responding to Jesus. So we make really, really clearly defined next steps for people, ultimately getting them to the point where they're actually serving online. Like, we don't want you to just here to consume content. We want you to actually sign up, go through our volunteer onboarding process, put yourself on a schedule through our database, and show up at your designated service and host and then make people feel welcome, pray for people. We are launching a kind of a missional initiative where every ministry at Crossroads is responsible for doing 1,000 missional hours in the year. And so as an online community, we're taking on the fight against sex trafficking.
Oh, wow.
And so it's getting 1,000 people to do 1 hour of work, you know, and getting those people there takes a bunch of tiny little steps. It's really hard to be, I'm here watching a sermon on Facebook, and tomorrow I'm showing up to stuff envelopes at this organization to help them, you know, fight against sex trafficking. So we have to build a bunch of tiny little steps, and we're doing everything from utilizing a gaming platform, Twitch, to gamify the sermon experience, because it allows us to building little challenges in there to get people to take those next steps, so that ultimately those steps of faith become a really well-formed and defined walk of faith.
Yeah, that's really good.
Scott, say a little bit, because you're actually doing this. What's the process that you're overseeing to help enable what Gabe is talking about?
So I think first off is we have some really incredible volunteers who we've empowered to take on kind of the reins of calling people and following up with them. And I think that as we empower our volunteers, we get a lot of that human contact. A lot of the volunteers that I have are a direct result of Jesus is Real Radio, or our internet campus, or a Facebook check-in. So we're already seeing kind of the benefits of this online reach. And I think that because they were reached out to, someone came alongside them and called them and said, hey, we want to see you at church. We want to see you at our physical campus. You know, for a lot of our local people, that's what happened. Somebody followed up with them. They may have responded at a Easter service or something like that, and someone followed up with them. So even our in-house follow-ups, having this same kind of methodology, we want to reach out to them. We want to make a relationship with them. We want to keep kind of a note on how they're doing. What does their family look like? How can we be in prayer for them? So the next time that I contact them, I have some context. And so I think that as we, you know, like it's been said, is building relationship with people. You know, the journey into discipleship is committing to intimacy. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we really want to do, and that's something that our volunteers are really passionate about. Yeah. So I think that in one way we're really benefited because the people that volunteer at Crossroads really want to be intimate with the people that they're contacting. So I think that You can have the best processes in the world, but if you don't have people who care, then those processes aren't what they're supposed to be.
Scott, it's similar to like the Celebrate Recovery community. Like the people whose lives have been transformed through Celebrate Recovery, they become the biggest advocates for it. And they're like, man, I want to go back in there and save people the way I was saved. So that's a really rad take. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah. Jay, you brought up formation in terms of one of the concerns. One of the pieces that I'm thinking through from kind of a teacher perspective of what is church and how do we define what church is. And so in the New Testament, you have ecclesia is the term, the gathering of for church. And it's based on the gathering of the Old Testament saints, even at Mount Sinai, just kind of the gathering of that sacred assembly. And then in the Reformation, they defined the church as the right preaching of the word, the right practice of the sacraments, and they actually added as well the right practice of church discipline. Yeah. And so one of my concerns is how do you be the church if there's no embodied community and there's no right practice of the sacraments, which the sacraments are a piece that you brought that up earlier. I'd love to hear about this, just in terms of if you depends how you define what the sacraments are, correct, first of all. Yeah. But if you just go to baptism and Lord's Supper, those are very embodied realities because it's water rushing over your head or being sprinkled on your head, whatever way you go there. And then the sacraments in terms of the Lord's Supper is taking in food to your body. And so it's a very, like you have to be there communally present. Yep. And just how you all think through, like even calling it internet church, is that like, what is church? How do we define what church is? Have you guys thought through that in terms of how you're moving forward and thinking through this?
Yeah. So for us, we refer to it as the iCampus, the internet campus. We view it as its own distinct gathering. Mm-hmm. We're careful not to use the word church. So we say the iCampus. Okay. So that's one. We do at the top of every service. I mean, we have people on live in front of a camera. Hey, you guys, we're excited to be gathered here today. We're going to be taking communion together. So right now, stop what you're doing. Go grab your elements, and we're going to walk through this together online. That's one. Now, Pastor Daniel joked about it yesterday. That's the only hang up if you have like a transubstantiated Eucharistic view, then you're stuck there and you can't do it. Yeah. So that's one. So that we do facilitate communion online that way and pray with people and explain the elements and we take it together. We have people comment, hey, let us know what you took communion with. One guy's like, I was camping, so I had toast and coffee. And I'm like, okay. He's like, I didn't want to miss the service. I'm sorry. This is all I have. And they're like confessing in the comment section. Yeah. So we kind of unpack that. The baptism piece, we haven't cracked that piece. Okay. I've been invited to be flown out and do like meetups where we have large pockets and congregations of people that get together. And like, would Crossroads ever come out and hold a baptism? I don't want it to be all about Crossroads. I would love for it to be a partnership with a local church, showing up. Hey, I'm here. Let's do a meetup. Let's do a barbecue. Let's share a meal together. Yeah. And then we're going to hold a baptism service. So those are things that we have yet to crack the code on.
One of the things interesting, I was involved in a big worldwide conference call on Internet Church, and there's a group that starts in Amman, Jordan, that reaches into the Arabic world, much of which is Muslim. Right. And they're reaching into Iran in places where they can't go. Right. The toughest one is out of London, and it's reaching into Iran, and it's doing it in Persian. Wow. And you cannot do stuff openly in Iran. Right. Yeah. Oh, yeah. And they're Anglicans, so they're not transubstantiation, but you have to have an ordained guy there to make it real. And what they're doing is they're having an ordained guy in London on video participating with a local guy who has some standing in the little group that's meeting there in wilds of Iran. Yeah. And the guy in London gives his credence to the guy in Iran who's actually doing the sprinkling in their case. Yeah. There's ways to get around it, even in a high church environment, if you're serious for Jesus.
And yesterday at the conference, I mean, people got stuck on this point, right? Like, how do you vet someone online? That's a very curated version of themselves. How dare you? It got kind of heated. It was cool. It was a good discussion. But yeah, I hear you. I mean, everything, we always say, like, the safest church is the one that doesn't take any risks. It's the one that has its door closed. That's the safest church ever. It's all about risk and how much you're willing to take and how much you're willing to be invested. And that,
I love those examples. And And again, like I said early, it's not monolithic. So that's like, man, it's inspiring to me to hear about these parts of the world where digital technology is taking the gospel in ways that otherwise would have been impossible. My major concern, though, is that those stories don't then get leveraged in such a way that hyper-consumeristic, and we're all hyper-consumeristic living here in the West, not all, but most of us.
Hyper-individualistic.
Hyper-individualistic,
right.
Everything's personalized and convenient, and at the touch of a button or a swipe of a finger in my back pocket. I think my concern is that we don't say, man, look at the way it's taking the gospel to these parts of the world where it otherwise wouldn't have gone. It's a great thing. So I'm just going to do the same. I think to your point, Patrick, earlier, we have to get to that place where we say, okay, how do we take ourselves as deeply as we can into what it means to be the church? So, for example, along those lines, you take the underground church in China, for example, which digital technologies for a long time were an incredibly helpful, and still are an incredibly helpful process in the way Christ is coming to change lives in that country. However, they also then literally risk their lives to gather. Like, that's why it's called underground churches, because they're going to prison and, like, to physically gather still, because they realize, okay, we got to keep going. Like, it's not enough. And I'm encouraged that Crossroads is trying to wrestle with those questions, because I love your candor and your honesty, Gabe, about, there are pieces we haven't cracked yet. And I'm going to pray and hope that you do, because again, I think digital technologies as initiating spaces are incredible, but what we can't do is feed the consumeristic mindset that, oh, this is it, dude. I got my 40-minute sermon and it was awesome and I feel great. And I'm, I've had my encouragement for the day, and that's not the church, right? That's church is so much more than that, like you said.
And one of the other concern maybe I'd have is that we're redefining what these things are in the doing of them over maybe online. So I'm not sure historically the church would say that, like Lord's Supper, you can do that even individualistically.
I would agree with you. Yeah, Andrew McGowan writes about this extensively.
I read the book, Ancient Christian Worship. Yep,
that's right. Mm-hmm. And he talks about how the table is the table for the community of Christ, that you don't take.
It's a covenant participation, which means it's necessarily communal, but then it gets into, what does communal mean? Like,
that's exactly right.
If you're online together, is that a community? Yep. What does that look like? So, it's a lot of it comes down to even going back to ecclesiology and defining terms and what are these things. And as technology increases, as you have barriers to do certain things, how do you perform these things?
Yeah.
Those are hard questions to answer.
Yeah. How do you experience them, perform them, participate in them in a communal way that really truly connects you as a community? And I'm not arguing that it's impossible online. I think we would all agree it's more effective shoulder to shoulder. But I'm grateful for churches that are wrestling with how much can we do digitally, and I haven't cracked that either, so I'm just going to wait for you to figure it out.
We're on it. We got our best.
Is there a model that you guys are looking to, or are you guys pioneers in this in terms of?
Definitely not pioneers.
Okay. Yeah. But are you like looking to someone like following? Like, is anyone else doing this in the way that you're seeing, like, man, I'd love to do it like that? Because you mentioned some more negative examples in terms of, like, fully online stuff.
Right.
I just didn't know if you guys were watching some others.
Yeah.
And see what they're doing.
We have the regular key players. I was talking with Gary about this. The Life Church guys have been so generous. Take our phone calls, do video conferences with us. I love, Saddleback and Elevation Church do a really good job as far as connecting people out in the community, like a good way to find a group in your area.
Okay. Yeah.
So I do love that component. But yeah, we really are highly collaborative in this. But I would say the lane where we, I think, are unique is the evangelistic thing. Like, that's the thing where we're going to run in. That's our sweet spot.
Yeah.
And other churches do other things super, super well. Spiritual formation, discipleship, very important. It's definitely up there. But for us, like, the vehicle that we drive will vary, but the lane stays the same. It's evangelism. Yeah.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Gabe, can I ask you a question just really quick? I'm curious to know sort of, the cult of Christian celebrity. It wasn't born out of the digital age. It existed long before that, but the digital age is giving us technologies that's accelerating it in crazy ways. And do you guys ever talk about that and how you wrestle with that? Like, is this we gotta, like, what's the balance between this being a personality driven mechanism versus a real, I'm just curious about that.
Yeah. One of the things that I appreciate about Pastor Daniel is out of 52 weeks, he preaches 36, sometimes less. And so the reason is he's only been in that seat for about 7 years. So really that's a young startup. So he's at the point now where that number 36 is getting less and less, and he's really developing like a teaching team, of which I'm on that team. So I do see churches, North Coast, I think, does that too, like a split team model. And I think that might be a healthier moving away from that sole celebrity. But again, it's leveraging what you have when you have it. But I do think that I think a teaching team model might help aid that in some ways. But again, we're not ashamed of how Daniel uses that. People recognize them. I think it's super helpful, the way his approach is and just how real he is. But that is something that we're aware of.
Yeah, you've got the Kardashians on one side where it's
they're here,
exactly our model.
Are you saying the Crossroads Kardashians? Is that what you're saying?
No. But
I'm so glad.
Which one is
Wait, where is this going?
Gabe is Kim or
whichever one is Kanye West. I want to be.
Yeah, there you go. But see, you've got the other side there. You've got Peter in the first century or Isaiah. And the reason they're famous is because they're glorified Jesus, and people want to be like that.
That's right.
They want to glorify Jesus too. So celebrity, what you're celebritizing is a key thing. Being well known for Jesus is a celebrity of a sort, but it's not the Kardashians, I'm glad to say.
Yeah.
He brought it back.
In terms of the scripture, it's kind of interesting that you have, and I'm just throwing this out there because I've been thinking through it even with our online education, that Paul in 1 Thessalonians says, I want to be with you face to face, but I can't. So he actually writes this letter, which is a form of using the technology of the time, but his greatest desire is like, I want to be with you. He actually sends Timothy over there because he can't. He says Satan hindered him. Yeah. And then he writes the letter and says, here's what we need to talk about. And he ends up going back to visit them. But there's a great balance, I feel like, of kind of prioritizing. I want to be with you face to face. It's not possible right now, so I'm going to use the means that I have. I'm going to write to you. I'm going to send Timothy. I am going to come back around and visit you to make sure everything's okay. And so I just keep on going back to that example in terms of both a priority and a willingness to use what he has to communicate with them.
Yeah,
so
that's spot on, man. I'm with you. You know, last night I'm here in Portland, so I FaceTime with my family. You know, my wife, my two little kids. Right,
scratches an itch,
which
but
is
it's not,
awesome. It's awesome. But what does it do? Is like it scratches the itch, and then once I hang up, the itch is greater, and now I'm like, oh, tonight I go home, land at 8:30, and I give them real hugs. And I think that's where we're all trying to get. Leverage the technology, but embed in people a deeper journey that creates that sort of longing for one another and for Jesus and for the community of the body.
For the people who simply can't attend church, we are setting them up for failure when we make the case that only physical attendance is true participation. You know, like they're getting beat, they beat themselves up for it. There's a number of people who serve online who like, Pastor Gabe, I found Crossroads because my mom was sick and like I couldn't go to church. And I felt like God was done with me. Like there was nothing I could contribute. There's no more I could do. And again, what we're seeing, the most committed people, like Scott was saying, are the people who couldn't attend church, but there was something there to catch them, some kind of a net, and that they were able to be brought back in and nursed back to health to the point where they could participate. So that was for us, trying to meet that need. And hearing those stories is huge.
And that's where at Grace Community Gresham, my church, that we're new in this whole thing. We just started doing Facebook Live. Our primary thing has been people who can't come to church, members of our congregation that just love Grace, but their physical stuff, they can't come. They're in nursing homes or something. And they're literally crying. I get to be with you guys, not just listen to a podcast. The other thing I'd like to say too is we tend to think physical presence. We think of 90 minutes on Sunday morning. That's not what we're after, for crying out loud.
That's right.
We're trying to get people beyond the 90 minutes on Sunday morning into community groups and real service for Jesus. So we're all in the same process. How do we bring it to where you really get to know people in the real life so they can become disciples and servers for Jesus?
Maybe this is why we need house churches, though, also for people who are shut in at home. You go meet with them. You know what I mean? Like you go
bring church.
You go gather to them. I wonder, just in the early church, there had to be people like that as well who couldn't get out and were lame or whatever, just health-wise couldn't get out. I wonder if that was some of the impetus for house church. I don't know. I'm just trying to.
I have a great friend down in the Bay Area who leads a really large church, Isaac Serrano, that many of us know.
Oh, yeah.
And he leads a large church in the Bay Area. And one of their campuses, they record his or whoever's teaching they record the sermon, and then one of their worship leaders takes the video to an elder care facility in town. Cool. They play the video of the sermon, and then the worship leader leads hymns.
Oh, that's awesome.
That's
cool.
Yeah. It's like, okay, boom. There's technology leveraged in beautiful incarnation.
It's like the micro church movement too, like Mingo and those guys.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
That's cool.
Well, this has been really good. I feel like we're just scratching the surface. So much more to talk about, but we've got to get off here. So
buy Jay's book and read it.
Go
to Crossroads Online and see it.
There you go. Yeah, thanks so much, guys, for coming on. This has been great. Yeah, thanks.
Thanks for listening to Food Trucks in Babylon. The music you hear is provided by our friends at Humble Beast Records. If you like the show, please leave us a review and feel free to subscribe. To learn more about Western Seminary, visit us at westernseminary.edu.